The slap didn't just sting, it detonated. The sting came first, sharp and immediate, the sound of it slicing through the candlelit air like a gunshot in a church. Then came the silence. Deafening, suffocating. Every wine glass in the room seemed to pause mid-toast, suspended in disbelief. I didn't raise my hand to touch my cheek. I didn't cry. I stood there, skin throbbing, heart frozen, wondering if what just happened had actually happened. Then I heard the laugh. Not one, not two, but a ripple of them. Snorts, chuckles, a muffled cackle from someone at the far end of the long banquet table. Then my mother's voice. She didn't gasp or scold. She didn't even sound surprised. She sipped her wine, leaned toward my sister-in-law, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Finally, someone put her in her place." My father, sitting beside her, chuckled in agreement like he'd just witnessed a moment of poetic justice. My brother clapped once half sarcastic like it was some sort of joke. My husband, Mark, lowered his hand and returned to his chair as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just slapped his wife across the face in front of 80 people at my father's 60th birthday dinner. I stood in silence, surrounded by people I was raised to believe were family, feeling like I'd just been publicly executed, but no one saw a problem. No one stood up for me. No one asked if I was okay. I looked around the room and saw every face I had grown up with. My aunt, who used to braid my hair. My cousin, who I once helped through her divorce. My godfather, who once told me I'd grow up to be too much woman for most men. They all just sat there, watching, grinning. Mark didn't apologize. He didn't flinch. His wine glass hadn't even tipped. His voice was calm when he said, "You had it coming, Emily. You always do." That's when I realized I was done pretending. I didn't storm out. I didn't scream. I reached into my clutch, took out my phone, and snapped a picture of my cheek. Then I turned on the video recorder and scanned the room. Every face, every smile, every cruel eye. My father's smirk. My mother's smug satisfaction. Mark's cold indifference. The camera caught it all. No one stopped me. No one cared. This wasn't just a slap. It was a message. One sent from my husband, cheered on by my blood. And it wasn't the first time they'd tried to shrink me. But it would be the last. I walked to the end of the table, picked up a bottle of wine, and poured myself a glass with a hand that did not shake. The chatter resumed like nothing had happened. But something had. Something irreversible. The sound of that slap would echo in my ears for months. Not because it hurt, but because of the laughter that followed. The collective agreement that I deserved it, that I was too much, too successful, too outspoken, too everything they were taught to suppress in a woman. I drank the wine in one slow motion and looked directly at Mark. His eyes met mine. He looked bored, annoyed that I was making a scene. My father said from his seat, "If you can't take it, maybe you shouldn't dish it out." My mother added, "Marriage is about compromise, dear." I nodded. I smiled. I raised my glass and said loud enough for the room to hush again, "To clarity." They thought I meant forgiveness. They had no idea. The only thing clearer than the wine in my glass was my next move. I walked to the exit, every heel click on the marble a declaration. Not one person followed me. Not one text came through. Not even from Mark. That's when I knew exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a breaking point. And I wasn't walking out a victim. I was walking out ready. Not to scream, not to fight, but to expose. To burn the mask off every smiling face that applauded my humiliation. My family laughed when my husband slapped me, until they found out who he really was, and what I was really capable of. My name is Emily Hart. I am 32 years old, a corporate finance attorney based in Manhattan, and until that night, I genuinely believed that being strong, successful, and disciplined would be enough to earn the respect of those closest to me. I believed that keeping my head down, doing the right things, saying the right things, achieving things no one in my family ever dreamed of would somehow translate to love. What a lie. My family didn't love me. They tolerated me. Barely. And my husband Mark, the man they all adored, the man they constantly reminded me I was lucky to have never actually saw me as an equal. I was a challenge to be subdued, something wild to be tamed. And that slap, that public blow, was simply the moment he let the mask fall, knowing he'd be applauded instead of condemned. I met Mark 5 years ago. He was charming, attentive, well-spoken, and had that steady kind of confidence that made people gravitate to him. He wasn't flashy or loud. He was the opposite. Calculated. Controlled. My family loved him from the first moment he opened his mouth. My father shook his hand and said, "Finally a real man." My mother leaned in and whispered to me, "Don't screw this up." I didn't. I did everything by the book. I played the perfect daughter, the perfect wife. I balanced court cases with family brunches, firm deadlines with dinner parties. I downplayed my raises. I dressed modestly. I avoided work talk at family events. And slowly I shrank. Inch by inch, I folded myself into a version of Emily they could handle. Quiet, composed, accommodating. I gave up the London promotion, turned down the partnership in Chicago, and chose New York because it was closer to Mark's parents and mine. I convinced myself I was choosing love, but in truth, I was choosing convenience, everyone else's. Mark was the kind of man who always smiled when others were watching. He brought flowers, pulled out chairs, sent anniversary gifts to my parents. He said the right things, but at home, he made sure I knew my place. He called me difficult when I disagreed, emotional when I had opinions, dramatic when I questioned his decisions. He never hit me before that night, but he didn't need to. His control came in words and silence, in raised eyebrows and sarcastic remarks. He'd disappear for hours, days, then return with stories that didn't quite line up. When I questioned them, he'd turn it around. "Why are you always suspicious? Can't you trust me?" My family always took his side. If I vented, I was told I was overreacting. My mother said, "You have a good man, stop pushing him away." My father told me, "This is why women like you end up alone." Every time I tried to assert myself, they made me feel like I was breaking something sacred. So I stopped talking. I buried it all. And on the outside, we looked perfect. Mark was the golden husband. I was the overachieving wife. Everyone admired us. No one really knew us, not even me. That birthday dinner had been planned for weeks. A formal affair in a rented ballroom, black tie, expensive catering, live jazz. I bought a new navy dress. Mark said I looked powerful, not beautiful. I knew that tone. I knew what he meant. He hated when I looked confident, when I walked into a room like I belonged there. That night, I dared to correct him during a toast. I made a joke lighthearted about how he never remembered where we first met. It was small, silly, but he didn't like being embarrassed, not in front of my family, not when he was already irritated by the promotion I had just accepted 2 weeks prior without consulting him. He hadn't congratulated me. My father had said, "You're making more than him now, aren't you?" I had smiled. Mark had clenched his jaw. Now I understand that the slap wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated, the culmination of years of being told I was too much, too ambitious, too loud, and in that moment, he knew he could do it. Because I had no one in that room, no allies, no safe hands, only eyes that watched and lips that laughed. I was not just slapped by a husband, I was betrayed by an entire bloodline that saw me as an inconvenience, not a daughter. And it all started long before Mark, long before I became a wife. I wasn't attacked in that moment. I was erased, silently, slowly, with every smile I forced and every opinion I swallowed, until I became someone even I didn't recognize. That slap wasn't just a violent act, it was a verdict, a sentence passed by a jury I once called family. Before the slap, before the silence and the whine and the exit, there were the compromises. Hundreds of them. Small ones at first. Changing the color of the living room walls because Mark found navy too cold. Skipping a business conference in Boston because his mother's church group was hosting a luncheon and they wanted us there. Not wearing heels around his friends because it made him uncomfortable that I stood taller. Declining a promotion to senior associate because the role involved too much travel and Mark believed a good wife should be home for dinner more often. Each of those things on their own seemed trivial, reasonable even. A good partner makes sacrifices right. A good daughter prioritizes family. A good woman supports her husband's dreams and downplays her own. That was the narrative I had been taught, modeled and swallowed without question. But those little sacrifices had a cost, and I didn't fully grasp how much until I realized I had whittled myself down to a fraction of the person I used to be. I once dreamed of becoming a legal strategist for Fortune 500 companies. I had been offered interviews in London, Tokyo, and Geneva. I had the credentials, the grit, the reputation. But every time an opportunity knocked, there was always a reason to decline. "We just moved," Mark would say, or "I can't handle the house on my own," or worse, "You really think a marriage can survive that much distance?" So I stayed. I compromised. I turned down dreams for the sake of maintaining peace. At the time, I believed I was choosing love over ambition. But in hindsight, I see it clearly. I was choosing to make everyone else comfortable while silently erasing myself. And it wasn't just Mark. My parents played their part too. When I first mentioned the London offer, my mother looked horrified. "But who will take care of us when we're older?" she asked. My father said men don't marry women who put career above family. They didn't celebrate my success. They endured it. Barely. When I made partner at the firm, Mark forgot the date. My parents sent a card that arrived 2 weeks late with no note, just their names signed in printed ink. When my brother's wife announced her pregnancy, the entire family held a dinner in her honor. When I closed the biggest deal of my career, my father said, "That's nice, but when are you going to give us grandkids?" I began to understand that no matter how much I achieved, it would never be enough, not for them. My value in their eyes was never tied to my intellect, my accomplishments, or my integrity. It was tied to my usefulness. Was I pleasing? Quiet, obedient. That's what counted. That's what was rewarded. Every time I pushed back, I was punished. Not overtly. They didn't scream or slam doors. They withheld affection. They made passive comments. They excluded me from group texts. They made me feel difficult, dramatic, burdensome. Over time, I internalized those labels. I began apologizing for things that weren't my fault. I began asking for permission before making decisions that should have been mine alone. I became dependent on Mark's approval, on my parents' crumbs of praise. I needed them to see me as good, as worthy, as enough. That's what hurt the most after the slap. Not just the pain, but the realization that I had given everything, my time, my energy, my silence to people who would never, ever see me. Not really. They didn't love me. They loved the version of me that kept quiet, that smiled through the insults that made their lives easier by not taking up too much space. That night at that dinner, I had reached my limit. Not because Mark hit me, but because he knew he could. Because I had taught him through years of concessions that I wouldn't fight back, that I'd take it, that I'd make excuses. But I didn't. Not this time. I poured the wine. I took the picture. I walked out, and in doing so, I finally chose myself. Not the version they wanted, not the smaller, quieter, softer Emily, but the real one. The one who was done trading her soul for proximity to people who only loved her when she was easy to ignore. It's funny how control doesn't always look like control. It doesn't always come with shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it comes with soft smiles, gentle suggestions, and 1,000 tiny cuts that bleed you out without leaving a single bruise. That's how Mark did it. That's how my family did it too. They never called it manipulation. They called it love, concern, wisdom. But it was always about shrinking me, bending me into something smaller, quieter, easier to swallow. And for the longest time, I let them. I thought that was what love meant: compromise, understanding. I ignored the discomfort, the unease. I mistook the tightness in my chest for a sign that I was too sensitive. I told myself to be more agreeable, less reactive, more patient. But looking back, the signs had always been there. The first time Mark made me feel wrong for succeeding, it was subtle. I had just landed a major client, and I came home glowing. He smiled and said he was proud of me, but then added, "Just don't let it go to your head." The next morning, he was cold, distant. He said he felt like I didn't need him anymore. And I remember apologizing. apologizing for making him feel insecure, apologizing for my own happiness. With my family, it started much earlier. When I got into Columbia, they congratulated me with tight smiles and cautious words. "Don't let the city change you," my mother warned. "Just remember where you come from," my father said, as if becoming educated, ambitious, driven was something shameful, as if my independence was a betrayal. When I started dating Mark, they were relieved. He was polite, traditional, he made them feel comfortable. And the more I fit into his world, the more praise I got. But it came with a price. I had to laugh at jokes that made me cringe. I had to excuse behavior that made me feel small. I had to watch him speak over me in conversations and smile as if it didn't sting. He interrupted me constantly, corrected me in public, dismissed my opinions with that same condescending tone my father used when I was a teenager. And every time I tried to name what was happening, they made me feel crazy. "You're reading too much into it. Mark adores you. Stop creating problems. Not everything is a battle, but it felt like a battle, a quiet one, a daily one, a war I was losing piece by piece. I lost my confidence, my clarity, my voice. I stopped trusting my instincts. I began second-guessing everything. Should I have worn that dress? Should I have spoken up in that meeting? Should I have accepted that compliment or downplayed it? I started living in constant self-surveillance, monitoring every word, every gesture, every decision. Not for myself, but for how it would be received, how it would be interpreted. And when I couldn't predict their reactions, I simply went silent. Silence became my armor, my protection, but it also became my prison. That's the thing about emotional control. It doesn't break you in half. It erodes you. It turns you into someone you don't recognize. Someone who flinches at kindness because you're not sure it's real. Someone who mistakes peace for the absence of tension, not the presence of safety. I remember the first time I tried to set a boundary with Mark. It was small. I asked him not to check my emails. He said, "If you have nothing to hide, why does it bother you?" And just like that, I folded. I convinced myself he was right. I told myself I was being too rigid. I deleted my password, gave him full access, and he made it seem like that was what love looked like. Transparency, openness. But I see it now for what it was. Control, disguised as intimacy. Just like my mother's insistence that I call her before every big decision. Just like my father's subtle jabs about women in power. Just like Mark's resentment every time I got praise. They all needed me to be smaller so they could feel bigger. So when the slap happened, when his hand struck my face and the room watched silently, it wasn't a new event. It was the climax of a story that had been writing itself for years. That moment didn't start at the dinner table. It started long before in every choice I made to please people who never intended to see me as whole. The moment Mark's hand met my cheek, it was like time fractured. There was the before, where I still held on to some diluted belief that love or at least decency still existed in that room. And then there was the after. The after was quiet, not because it was peaceful, but because every piece of me had shattered in a way that made sound feel foreign. It wasn't just the sting. It wasn't just the heat spreading from my cheekbone to my ear. It was the stillness in the room, the kind of stillness that confirmed that this wasn't a mistake, that this wasn't shocking to them, that this had always been a possibility waiting to happen. I wasn't looking for anyone to yell. I wasn't even expecting them to be outraged. But the laughter, the smug little chuckles the way my sister-in-law bit her lip to hide a grin, the low, breathy finally from my mother, those reactions didn't just hurt. They annihilated. They turned me from a person into a spectacle. I realized in that moment that the people around me didn't see me as family. They saw me as a threat, a problem, an inconvenience that needed to be put in her place. Mark just happened to be the one willing to do it physically, and they respected him for it. That was the part that broke me. Not the pain, not even the betrayal. It was the applause. Subtle, quiet, but unmistakable. My father cleared his throat and took a sip of his whiskey. My brother whispered something to his wife and they both laughed. Mark didn't apologize. He didn't flinch. He just sat back down and continued eating like nothing had happened. And I stood there, eyes wide open, heart pounding, trying to understand what story I had just been written out of. I had been erased so thoroughly, so publicly, that for a split second I wondered if maybe I had deserved it. Maybe I had been too difficult, too ambitious, too much. Maybe this was just the cost of being who I was. But then something inside me snapped. Not the kind of snap that leads to rage or revenge, but the kind that comes with clarity, the kind that whispers, "You're done here." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I simply pulled out my phone and captured the moment. My red cheek, my blank face, the smirks, the indifference. I took a picture of the room, every guest, every expression. I wanted a record, not for them, for me, proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't imagining the cruelty, that the slap wasn't the beginning. It was the final page of a chapter that had been written in gaslight and silence. I walked back to the table, poured myself a glass of wine, and raised it like a toast. To clarity, I said. They thought I meant forgiveness. They thought I was about to laugh it off, to make a joke, to let it go like I had done 100 times before. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't performing. I drank it slowly, letting the bitterness coat my tongue, and locked eyes with Mark. He looked through me, detached, bored, like I was a scene he had already watched too many times. And that was when I knew I had stayed too long. In this marriage, in this family, in this story. I left the room without another word. My heels echoed down the marble floor, each step heavier than the last. Not with shame, but with decision. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wait for anyone to follow. No one did. That silence was confirmation. Confirmation that I had never really belonged there. Not as myself. Only as a quieter, softer, more obedient version. And I was done being her. That was the last time I ever stepped into that room as their Emily. The last time I let them speak for me, define me, diminish me. From that point on, I would not ask for permission. I would not beg for understanding. I would not trade my dignity for their approval. The slap didn't end me. It woke me up. I didn't go home that night. I didn't go anywhere familiar. Instead, I walked until my feet hurt past lit storefronts and busy streets, until I found a quiet bench in Riverside Park where I could finally sit and feel the weight of what had just happened. Not just the slap, but everything. Years of silence. Years of compliance. Years of pretending I wasn't being slowly erased. I sat there in the cold, scrolling through the photos and videos I had taken at the dinner, my face still red. The smiles, the laughter, the indifference. It was all there, captured forever. Evidence. Not of the slap itself that would fade, but of the culture that had nurtured it, enabled it, celebrated it. That's when I remembered Sandra. We hadn't spoken in months. She was a former client turned friend, a journalist with a spine of steel and a specialty in exposing hidden abuse. I had helped her through a brutal divorce from a man who had nearly destroyed her reputation, and she had once told me, "If you ever need the truth told, I'm one call away." So I called. Her voice was steady alert, as if she could already hear the storm brewing in my chest. I told her what happened. Every detail. And for the first time that night, I heard the sound of outrage. Real outrage. Not silence. Not justification. Not blame. Just pure, unfiltered disgust. "You have proof?" she asked. I sent her the images. The short clip where the room sat silent while I stood shaking. She didn't need to see the slap to understand what it meant. She knew what it was. A message. A punishment. She said, "This isn't just a personal story. This is a pattern. This is what happens to women who don't shrink." Sandra didn't want to turn it into tabloid gossip. She wanted to write an essay. A deep dive, a profile of the quiet violence that happens in families that pride themselves on appearances. She wanted to tell my story not as a spectacle, but as a mirror. I agreed, anonymously at first. I didn't want to be the face of it. I was still too raw, too exposed. But as we talked, as she outlined what the piece could mean, something shifted. I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every woman who had ever been called too much, every daughter who had been told to tone it down, every wife who had been punished for shining too brightly. I decided to let her use my name, my real one, my full one, Emily Hart, attorney, survivor, witness. She worked quickly. She interviewed me. She interviewed others who had watched me navigate this double life of success and suppression. She called it The Woman Who Wouldn't Shrink, and when the article published 2 weeks later in a national magazine, it exploded. It was everywhere, shared by lawyers, activists, celebrities, survivors. My inbox flooded. Women from every corner of the country reached out, some anonymous, some bold. All of them had stories that echoed mine, not identical, but familiar. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. The backlash came fast. Mark was suspended from his firm pending an ethics investigation. My father's name was dragged through public forums as a man who condoned domestic violence. My mother was removed from her church leadership role after a video surfaced of her laughing post-slap. And suddenly, the people who had once held power over me were scrambling to explain themselves. But it was too late. The silence they had wrapped themselves in had become deafening to the world. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't need to. My words had already been spoken, and they were louder than anything I could have screamed that night at dinner. That was the beauty of it. I didn't have to destroy anyone. I just had to show people who they really were. Once the article took off, everything changed. Not instantly and not without backlash, but the shift was undeniable. Where once there had been silence and shadows, there was now light. People were talking not just about what happened to me, but about what happens every day to women like me, who are told to be less to give more, to never speak unless spoken to. I started receiving invitations. Law schools wanted me to speak about gender dynamics in professional spaces. Advocacy groups reached out asking if I would share my story with survivors navigating emotional abuse. Even some of my former clients wrote me letters not asking for help, but offering it. They saw me now not just as their attorney, but as one of them, someone who had walked through the fire and lived to tell the story. And amidst all this, I did something I never thought I would do. I filed for divorce. It was clean, strategic. I had no interest in drama or vengeance. I didn't want his money. I didn't want anything except the legal severing of a relationship that had nearly erased me. My attorney was a woman I had once mentored. She handled everything with precision and quiet rage, the kind that doesn't shout but slices with truth. Mark never contested it. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg. He just signed the papers and disappeared. His reputation was already in freefall. His silence only confirmed the truth. But the bigger shift came with my family. They didn't call, not once. No apology, no clarification, no explanation. Just more silence. At first, I thought it might hurt, but instead it felt like freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't contorting myself to be accepted. I wasn't waiting for a nod, a smile, a breadcrumb of approval. I stopped checking for their reactions. I stopped wondering if they were embarrassed. I realized their shame wasn't mine to carry. I moved out of the apartment I had shared with Mark and into a space of my own, small but full of light, with walls I could finally call safe. I painted it however I wanted. I placed my law degrees front and center, not to brag, but to remind myself that I had built something real, something no one had handed me. I adopted a dog, a mutt, with cautious eyes who trusted slowly just like I did. We learned to feel safe together, and for the first time in years, I slept without waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding from dreams, where I was back in that dinner, back in that chair, back in that moment. I was no longer haunted. I was rebuilding. The silence from my family grew louder in public. Questions started circulating. Why hadn't they reached out? Did they condone the violence? Their friends began to distance themselves. Invitations stopped arriving. My mother's book club dissolved. My father's investment partners pulled out of a pending deal. Not because of anything I said, but because of what they didn't say. Their silence was damning, and I didn't feel sorry. I didn't feel triumphant either. I felt steady, grounded, as if I had finally stepped into the life I was meant to live before I was taught to shrink. I began writing again. Not just legal briefs, but essays, stories, pieces about power and pain and finding your voice in a world built to silence you. And people listened. They didn't just hear my words, they felt them. Because I wasn't just writing for myself. I was writing for every woman who had ever sat at a table full of family and felt utterly alone. I was writing for the version of me who once believed that being good meant being quiet. I was done being quiet. I was becoming whole. It started with whispers, then turned into rumors, and finally grew into full-blown fallout. The people who had once laughed while I was being slapped now found themselves on the other end of public judgment, and there was no quiet place left to hide. Mark lost his position at the firm within a week. Officially, it was called a leave of absence, but insiders knew it was permanent. Clients had pulled out. Partners were divided. One high-profile investor released a statement expressing concern about his personal ethics. No one wants a scandal in a tailored suit sitting across the table in a billion-dollar negotiation. His name became synonymous with hypocrisy. The man who had built his image on professionalism and charm now couldn't walk into a restaurant without someone whispering behind their menu. And it wasn't because of my words. It was because people had seen the photo. My face red and emotionless. The expressions around me. The laughter. The indifference. It spoke louder than any article. Meanwhile, my parents tried to hold their ground. My mother claimed I had exaggerated, that it was just a slap, just a moment, and that families work through things. But no one was buying it. A video had surfaced, someone else at the dinner had recorded it. The moment my mother smirked, the way my father said, "If you can't take it, don't dish it out." The internet didn't care about their polished holiday cards or carefully curated social media. They cared about the truth, and the truth had gone viral. My mother was asked to step down from the women's group she chaired at church. My father's name was quietly removed from a board he had served on for 20 years. Their friends stopped coming around. Their phones stopped ringing. The family that once clung to respectability now couldn't show their faces in public without a cloud of quiet contempt following them. But the most surprising reaction came from inside their own circles. My cousin, the one who used to play piano with me during the holidays, reached out. She said, "I saw what happened." "I believe you. I've seen how they treat strong women." She shared her own story, how she had been discouraged from pursuing a career, how her fiancé had quietly pressured her into quitting her job. She said she wished she had spoken up sooner. One by one, others came forward. Not publicly, not loudly, but through emails, texts, quiet coffee shop meetings. They thanked me. They told me they had watched the dinner unfold and felt complicit. They had laughed nervously, stayed silent. But now, they saw. They understood. That mattered more than any headline. That mattered more than any fallout. But not everyone changed. My brother never spoke to me again. My mother sent a letter handwritten calling me cruel, ungrateful, a destroyer of family. She said she forgave me even though I had humiliated them. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I wasn't interested in forgiveness from people who never offered it when I needed it most. What they were experiencing wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. A mirror held up too long, too clearly, too honestly. And Mark, he reached out once. A short email. No apology. Just a request. He wanted to meet, to talk, to explain. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I deleted it. There was nothing left to explain. His silence during the aftermath had been louder than any confession. His slap had been a full sentence. But his indifference afterward, that was the period at the end. I was done translating his behavior into something I could justify. I was done decoding my parents' silence into some warped version of loyalty. They all paid a price. Not because I demanded it, but because they thought they could break someone in public and walk away unscathed. They forgot that truth, when spoken clearly and calmly, is the loudest voice in any room. And I had finally learned how to use mine. Healing didn't happen overnight. It wasn't linear. Some mornings I woke up and felt powerful, untouchable, even like I had finally burned the rot from my life and stood in the ashes clean and strong. Other mornings I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had taken me so long to walk away. The shame, crept in quietly, whispering that maybe I had overreacted, maybe I had broken the very things I once worked so hard to protect. But each time that voice came, I answered it not with doubt, but with evidence. I reminded myself of the silence, the laughter, the justifications, the red mark on my cheek, the photo, the way Mark had gone back to eating, the way my mother had smirked, the way my father had said, "Well, maybe now you'll listen." Those weren't mistakes. They were choices. Choices made by people who had never truly seen me as a full person, only a role, a daughter, a wife, a performer in their play. And I had finally walked off stage. In the months that followed the article, I started therapy for the first time in my life. Real therapy, not the kind where you go once and lie about how fine you are. This time, I peeled everything back. I told the whole truth. Not just about the dinner, but about the childhood that shaped me, the family who trained me to seek praise as a form of oxygen, the marriage that mirrored the exact same script. My therapist didn't flinch. She just nodded and said, "You were never allowed to belong to yourself. But now you are." That sentence cracked something open inside me. I began reclaiming my time, my space, my mind. I took solo trips. I bought books I'd once been told were a waste of time. I repainted my office and filled it with things that mattered, pictures of women I admired, quotes that reminded me of my worth, photos of the view from my favorite hike. I didn't just move on. I built forward. One of the most powerful shifts came quietly. I stopped apologizing for everything, for speaking too confidently, for saying no, for not wanting to go to family functions, for cutting people off who made me feel small. I stopped explaining myself. I owed no one a justification for my boundaries. I also began mentoring younger women in my field, not just about legal strategy, but about personal agency. I told them, "Your brilliance doesn't require permission, and anyone who makes you feel like it does is afraid of their own mediocrity." They listened, some with tears in their eyes, some with fire in their chest. I knew that look. I had lived that feeling. I also reconnected with people who had quietly disappeared during the chaos, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. A few old friends returned this time with apologies, with honesty, with a willingness to hold space instead of judgment. And I allowed them in, carefully, slowly, because I had learned that forgiveness wasn't a performance. It was a choice, and trust had to be earned, not demanded. Most importantly, I began trusting myself. My gut, my voice, my instincts. I stopped shrinking in rooms to make others feel taller. I stopped laughing at jokes that made me uncomfortable. I stopped dimming my light to keep others from burning. I became full again. Not perfect, not unscathed, but full. On the 1-year anniversary of the slap, I stood alone in my apartment, lit a single candle, and raised a glass. Not to revenge, not to spite, but to freedom, to clarity, to the version of myself I had finally uncovered beneath all the years of quiet suffering. I wasn't the same woman anymore. I was stronger, yes, but more than that, I was mine. The hardest part wasn't walking away. It wasn't the silence that followed or the storm that erupted after the truth came out. It wasn't the loneliness or the whispers or the flash of recognition in strangers' eyes when they realized I was that woman from the article. The hardest part was deciding to never go back, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. To never again seek validation from people who had made me feel disposable. To never again trade pieces of my soul for temporary peace. That was the part no one warned me about, how healing comes with grief. Grief for the version of myself who waited for her mother's approval. Grief for the girl who believed love meant enduring, surviving, sacrificing. Grief for the years I spent playing a role, smiling through pain, nodding through disrespect. But grief is also a form of clarity. It strips away illusion. It leaves only truth behind. And that truth was this: I had never truly been free. Until now. That realization came not with a bang, but in moments. Quiet ones. A morning coffee without anxiety. A decision made without second guessing. A laugh that rose from my belly instead of being carefully measured. Freedom, I discovered, is not loud. It's calm. It's stillness in your chest. It's the absence of dread. And with that freedom came responsibility, not to fix others, not to change my family or redeem my past, but to protect my future, to guard the peace I had fought so hard to earn, to never again let anyone steal my voice, my power, my name, and maybe most importantly, to help others do the same. I began volunteering with women's shelters offering free legal consultations to survivors of domestic and emotional abuse. I sat with them in small rooms with peeling paint and listened to stories that mirrored mine in 100 different ways. Some had bruises, some didn't, but all of them carried the same weight. The same question, how do I get out? And I told them the truth, that getting out isn't just about leaving. It's about unlearning, rebuilding, reclaiming. I told them, you are not broken, you were bent, and you can straighten again. They believed me, because I wasn't speaking from a textbook. I was speaking from a dinner table, from a slap, from the quiet that followed. I also started speaking publicly universities, conferences, panels. I told my story not to relive the pain, but to light the path. I said, we don't owe anyone our silence. We don't owe our family our dignity. We owe ourselves a life that doesn't require hiding. And people listened. The narrative changed. Slowly, but it changed. More women began speaking up, sharing their stories, naming their pain, refusing to carry shame that didn't belong to them. As for my family, they remained distant. A few months after the article, my father sent a card. No apology, just a line that read, "You made your choice. Now live with it." I did. Gladly. And in doing so, I made another choice to stop the pattern, to end the legacy of silence and obedience. If I ever had children, they would know love without fear, support without strings, boundaries without betrayal. They would never be slapped at a table and told it was their fault. They would never have to choose between dignity and belonging, because I had already made that choice for them. I broke the cycle. I broke it by telling the truth, by refusing to shrink, by walking away and never looking back. The price was high, yes, but freedom always is. And I paid it in full with my story, with my scars, with my strength. I paid it so that no one else would have to.